Great. I think we'll get going and see if anybody else joins in the next few minutes. But I'm aware that we don't have loads of time. So thanks so much, everybody, for joining us this evening. I think a few of you attended a discussion a couple of weeks ago where we talked about Mariana Mazzucato's book, Mission Economy, and how some of the theory is being put into practice. So this evening is the first of what I hope will be one of many deep dives. And the aim of these is really where we put in the effort to examine the alternative opinions about books which we might naturally kind of lean towards agreeing with. And that is really to make sure that as a book club, we are avoiding becoming an echo chamber and are really examining our own opinions about books and therefore become more informed as a result. So yeah, I'm gonna coordinate the book club, which is part of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And I'm just going to put some links in the chat so that you can learn more about it if you like. There you go. So you can access them and join the book club. If you really enjoy it and want to stay in touch with what we're doing in the future, you can join the WhatsApp group. So we're really lucky this evening to have Matthew Ford with us. Matthew's worked with John Kay, who, if you don't know him, he's a pretty prominent economist. And Matthew's worked with him for the past few years on, it turns out, 2 books rather than 1. I was mistaken. So he's going to explain a little bit this evening about the main critiques. Basically, I discovered John Kay through reading a book review of Mission Economy in the FT, and it was written by him, and reached out. And Matthew's going to explain some of the main critiques which came up, and then really want this to be an open conversation where everybody can challenge and ask away and make it as participatory as possible. So in terms of format, I'm going to blast through a quick reminder, a quick overview of the main ideas in the book. Then everybody can go into breakout rooms for a few minutes and kind of get the juices flowing, think, okay, what are the main challenges to this approach? And then Matthew will outline some of his thoughts and we'll wrap up around 7:45. Matthew, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more just before I dig in?
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, so I'm a researcher for John Kay. I did my undergrad in history and economics, wasn't really sure what to do after that. I tried sort of all the standard consultancy things and didn't really enjoy it that much. And working for John has been great. As Anna said, we've done a couple of books. One of those is on sort of decision-making, philosophy of probability kind of stuff, which is called Radical Uncertainty, which I'd encourage everyone to go and buy, or at least get hold of some kind of free version of. And then whilst I was actually doing my master's at LSE, we also did another book called Greed is Dead, which is a bit more sort of socially focused, sort of looking at social role of markets and similar things to that. And at the moment, we're looking a lot at what the social role of business is, how we should conceive of the corporation, how it interacts with and helps the rest of society. And I suppose our thinking about mission economy kind of flows out of that. So what the right relationship between business and the state is, but also, how we should think about the future, about uncertain things, sort of costs, benefits, probability, how all of those factor into it.
Awesome, thanks, Matthew. And yeah, looking forward to digging in. There were definitely, even the session that we had last week, I think there were so many questions that people had that we didn't get around to, and also that people had and perhaps wanted to dig deeper into. So really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on them as well. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen and go over the main ideas before we go further. So yeah, I've got really into mural recently, so I hope you enjoy the bubbles. Oh, sorry, I've got more people joining. So yeah, a quick overview of mission economy. The main ideas really can be summarized in that innovation has direction, so does growth. And therefore, what Mariana Mazzucato is arguing is that we really need to consider and have a conversation about what direction that growth should occur in. One of her main ideas is about public value. So public value is value that is collectively created for a public purpose. And this really requires citizens to engage in defining purpose, assessing value, and then acting accordingly. She makes the point that missions are not new. And one of the core examples or the main example that she uses is Apollo. So there are examples of missions throughout history, although she also digs into why we need to also leave behind some characteristics of previous missions. And she really argues that mission-oriented strategies translate challenges into concrete problems, which may require organizations and sectors to collaborate. So it's really about pinpointing 21st century challenges, which tend to be very broad, and then translating them into something more specific and achievable, and putting very tangible, turning them into very tangible and specific ambitions. So she talks about clear direction being very important, experimentation being crucial, there needing to be a lot of interdisciplinary and interdepartmental collaboration. And like I said, in terms of being specific, being time-bound, measurable, and targeted is very much what she argues. A running theme throughout the book is the need to really invest in the public sector and the civil service to develop capacity in terms of people's trainings and ability to solve complex problems, and then also to put funding actually behind missions in a way that I think often the language of missions is used, but the funding isn't put in to support that. A way that it's often visualized, I think this is one of the main diagrams used to visualize missions, is that you've got, so grand challenges sit at the top, and these should be of societal relevance. So it might be climate change or the aging population or something very broad and very understandable, but quite difficult to pin down. This then is split into different missions. So climate change might have a more specific mission of the energy transition, or as we'll go on to look at, plastic-free oceans. Underneath the mission, there are lots of different sectors. So she argues that it can't just be one sector that resolves a mission. You'll need lots of collaboration between different parts of the economy. And then underneath the sectors, there are lots of mission projects, which are experimental problem-solving projects. So yeah, these are the 5 characteristics which really capture the essence of a mission and how they work. You need multiple bottom-up solutions, lots of cross-disciplinary collaboration between different actors, very targeted, ambitious, and yet realistic missions with clear direction towards a grand challenge of societal relevance. This is one example of a mission which has been talked about. So you can see here, you've got clean oceans, and then a plastic-free ocean is being defined quantitatively here. The chemical industry, marine life, AI, design, social innovation, all being relevant sectors, and then different specific problems which need to be solved through lots of collaboration. So that hopefully helps you visualize a mission. The first part of the book digs into 5 myths that impede progress on missions, and they can be summarized as follows. So you've got businesses create value and take risks, and actually what Mariana is arguing is that governments also create value and should also take risks, and we therefore shouldn't be highly critical of them when they take risks and fail, because that's actually just part and parcel of experimentation. The purpose of government is to fix market failures. So she argues rather that government shape markets. That's a core and very heavily repeated theme throughout the book. We really need to think about citizens as citizens rather than customers, and not treat government like a business because it's not serving the same purpose as a business. Outsourcing generally is not hugely helpful, I think, is a common theme, and that government shouldn't pick winners. This is quite an interesting one. So her point is that essentially governments are always going to some extent be choosing winners through the decisions that they make. And this quote helps capture it. It was because Obama was interested in the green transition that the Department of Energy provided guaranteed loans to companies like Tesla. So the choices that government makes and who they decide to invest in can then really help shape the economy in a certain direction. And actually, we should embrace that reality, is what she argues. Some of the key lessons to be drawn from Apollo are that the role of innovation is really important. So again, yeah, risk-taking is crucial. Organizational change, I found this part really interesting, about the need to think about complex problems and how that affects management. So she has a few pages about systems management and the real importance of communication across departments and the simultaneous way of managing so that decisions can be made quite autonomously in quite a decentralized way, at the same time as having very clear lines of accountability. Spillovers are a really interesting part of experimentation, in that often you don't realize what benefits will come from a certain experiment with a certain mission, and therefore we should develop ways to account for those spillovers. So she has a couple of pages about all of the different technologies which emerged as a result of investment in getting man to the moon. Oh, someone I think's just joined. We've got business in the state, so they can work really collaboratively and positively together. Leadership and purpose, she really emphasizes the vision that Apollo had and how that brought people together for a common purpose. I personally find this really interesting because, especially in the context of climate change, I would suggest that something we're lacking is really clear political vision that motivates change. So that's an interesting point that she made. And then outcomes-based budgeting, she was arguing that we really need to put our objectives and what we value in the economy at the center and work out how to achieve them, rather than start with our budget and work backwards from there. And then lastly, the last section of her book outlines 7 principles for a new political economy. I think most of these we've already broadly covered, but yeah, in quick summary, markets shape rather than fix. Governments should shape rather than fix markets. We need new organizations with dynamic capabilities, so basically very well-trained civil servants and innovative ways of managing. Outcomes-based budgeting, a really innovative or a new way to appreciating the way that risks and rewards are distributed. So government should, if it's participating in a lot of risk taking, which she advocates, it should also gain some of the rewards of that. A lot of participation that we can do through technology, especially now we have so many ways of doing so online. Stakeholder value, and then finally what she really hammers home is that value should be collectively created, and we really need to revise the purpose of economics and have a conversation about the direction in which we want the economy to go. So that was a whistle-stop tour of the book, just as a reminder, and apologies if you came for the last session because this is the exact same, but hopefully it's still useful. What we're now going to do is go into breakout rooms, and this we started in the last session, and what I suggest is that you focus on what might the challenges be of implementing missions, or even working out what they should be of using them in the first place. You can double click and create post-its and throw a few questions down just to get the juices flowing before Matthew will then outline his main critiques, and we can create a conversation from there. So I am about to put the link in the chat, and I encourage you to click on the link before going into breakout rooms, because you can't access it once you do. And you shouldn't need to log in or anything. You should just be able to click on it and enter. So what I'm going to do is create some breakout rooms. Hi, thanks everyone. How did that go? Does anyone want to share a couple of thoughts?
Well, the time was pretty short, but no, I mean, we were thinking about the applicability of missions in a low income or developing country setting, and whether or not perhaps there's a minimum level of development and capability within the institution and the individuals within the various institutions for a mission type approach to actually be able to be a functional pathway. But then the flip argument was that perhaps the lack of development or the lack of certain barriers that come with institutional sort of fixed ways of doing things may in fact work in their favor. So, and then we kind of ran out of time.
No, that sounds really interesting though. And yeah, I never quite, breakout rooms are funny, aren't they? Because I think when you're, yeah, it's good to hear that you had too much to talk about rather than not enough to talk about. Does anyone else want to share one more thought before we move on to Matthew?
I can share what we talked about in our breakout room. I think we were focusing on the practicalities of implementing missions, and a couple of things we come up with were trying to achieve that, and also someone was making an excellent point about the portfolio approach itself being such a difficult concept for the institutions to get their head around. There will be losers, and building that in.
Yeah, no, that is a big change of mindset. Not that I work in the civil service, so I'm sure some of you have a lot more experience of that than I do. All right, Matthew, over to you. We would love to hear some of your thoughts. Thanks,
Anna. So I think Mariana tells a lot of stories in her book, some of them very well, like I think especially the moonshots. It's a fantastic description of it and worth reading, for that alone, really. But there are other stories we can tell as well. So one I quite like is the advanced gas-cooled nuclear reactors, which the UK developed. They're a special UK design. We decided to build them in 1964. So this was the sort of time of Harold Wilson's white heat of technology speech. They were going to be great. They were going to be exportable. They were going to be providing cheap, clean energy. And we decided we'd build 5. We later built a 6th. And, everything seemed to be going well. Like this was a whole new design of nuclear reactor. It wasn't easy to do, but it got done. They weren't running at full capacity immediately, but, nothing ever does. It all seemed relatively okay. But it wasn't actually okay. So instead of taking about 20 years to get to full capacity, it took about 30 years. And in the end, it ended up costing the taxpayer about £50 billion. That's in 1996 money, which is when we finally got rid of them. And we know all of this, not because the National Audit Office has done a report on it, and not because the Public Accounts Committee has done a report on it, although both of those bodies are great and do a lot of good work, because Parliament was never actually told about any of this. It was all kept very quiet because actually it was going disastrously. No one wanted these things. The design never was exported. We found out because they were privatised, and ministers, sadly quite rightly, realised that lying to Parliament is one thing, but lying to the market is quite another. So what do we learn from this, truly disastrous story? I mean, arguably not very much. Like we were just hearing, it's difficult to think in a kind of portfolio sense. Some things work, some things don't. This was an example of something which didn't work. The moonshot is an example of something which probably did work. But I think there's something more important here, which is if you think about mission economy, and in fact, other books Mazzucato has written, there's no real data on what does work and what is useful, and whether actually on average the government tends to get this kind of thing right. So she refers to governments operating a bit like a venture capital fund, and I think that's a useful image. But it also shows there's a problem with this view, which is in a venture capital fund, you do actually have to make money. And you can tell if you've made money by how much you end up selling on your stakes in the companies you've invested for. And the government doesn't have that kind of problem. For Mazzucato, that's the government's great advantage. And I would say, whether it's more orthodox or whether it's just sort of more orthodox right-wing economic thinking, I don't know. But in more orthodox economic thinking, that's the government's great disadvantage, that you don't have that level of feedback. And so it's not really enough to trade stories. You've got to provide data, or you've got to have a very compelling theory if for some reason, there isn't data underlying this. And Anna's done a sort of fantastic summary of Mazzucato's story. It's not, I think, that the government should, say, invest in clean energy. That fits very well into the kind of market failure approach she criticizes. Like, we know clean energy is an important thing. It'll be underprovided by the free market. We understand all of that. There's a clear role for the government to do that. I think, and this is more interesting, it's not really either about a failure of patient capital. Like, if you really think that patient capital is something which is lacking and it's the government's role to provide this, I'd encourage you to look at Amazon or Tesla or any number of venture capital funded firms at the moment. Actually, investors don't seem to have that much of a problem with providing money and not getting a return for a very long time. I mean, Amazon has still not paid any dividends. Tesla, I think, has only just started to make money. And there is money out there for these things. And in fact, if you have a very diverse pool of people investing, there's no reason why there shouldn't be money out there for these things. So Mazzucato isn't saying we need the government to do things in a mission basis because public value requires it, because you can get that within a sort of market failure framework. And I don't think it's true to say that the issue is patient capital. The kind of innovation of this book is saying we need to think in this sort of mission way of nudging the economy towards various social goals, not crudely picking winners, like saying, Solyndra will give you a lot of money and you'll save the planet for us. But nonetheless, picking areas, basically picking things that we think people want. And that, as I understand it, is basically Mazzucato's story. My story will be a bit different, is that feedback is really, really important. And the big downside of governments is that feedback doesn't apply to them in the same way. As with the advanced gas cool reactor story, if you make a mistake, it doesn't always get found out. There aren't the same market imperatives to stop you making a mistake. You can go on and on making the mistake, and it can end up being a complete disaster. So what you really need to do is bring data to the table and say, we have these competing theories. One of these is more likely than the other. One of these is better supported by the data than the other. The sort of data I would bring is the sort of work people like Ben Fleeberg at Oxford have been doing, which is really fascinating, and I'd encourage people to check it out. He looks at mega projects, which are things which cost over £1 billion. And much of the sort of thing Mazzucato describes in Mission Economy would fall under the name of mega projects. And these, he says, tend to be disastrous. About 0.1% succeed on 3 major criteria. Sometimes they fail in sort of catastrophic terms. I think the very worst in terms of multiples of cost over expectation is the Scottish Parliament, which ended up costing about 17 times as much to build as it should have done. But there are many other failures. The Channel Tunnel is kind of something many of us probably know and love. It cost about twice as much as it was expected to. About half as many people wanted to use it as they expected to. It would have been better off not building the thing, at least at that cost and in that way. And the lesson from this is not that governments are uniquely bad at all of this. The Channel Tunnel was a private project. Governments aren't any worse or any better than large private sector organizations. The lesson from this is it's important to embed feedback into projects as much as is possible. And that's not feedback in the sense of I've made up some metric and I'm going to get some consultants to run the numbers for me, and then we'll have a meeting in the civil service and say yay or nay to it. That's actual credible feedback as much as possible from other people who have some kind of stake in it. Now, Mazzucato does address this. She addresses this in a really interesting way, actually. She talks about the example of Concorde. And she basically says Concorde was probably a failure. You know, we don't use it anymore. There's loads of noise pollution. It wasn't that useful. It was very impressive technologically. But she says, you know, it's not enough to just say it didn't work commercially. We've got to consider various spin-offs. We've got to consider kind of serendipitous inventions which happened as we created it. And that's a really interesting question. And when I read that, I thought, you know, this would be fantastic. I'd be very interested to learn, you know, whether this was true or not. But I didn't read that in Mission Economy. I read it in The Entrepreneurial State, which is her first book. And in The Entrepreneurial State, she says this. And then she has a footnote saying, and I'm actually, with a co-author, writing a paper on this. Currently, it's a working paper. That was back in 2014. We're going to develop new metrics to really assess, you know, was Concorde actually on balance a good thing, even if it didn't make a profit? But that paper, you know, doesn't exist online. It's never been published. And she makes the same point in Mission Economy, but there's no footnote this time. She just says, no one's done this kind of analysis. Now, I don't know why she hasn't done that analysis. It might be she got bored. It might be it was a harder challenge than she thought. It might be her priorities shifted. It might be she had better things to do. I certainly, you know, just to be clear, I don't think it's at all dishonest or anything like that. But the fact remains, these kind of metrics, people know they need to exist and they haven't been created. I mean, it's been 7 years since she was looking at Concorde and she hasn't been able to come up with a good metric for how you assess the social value. And I don't think you possibly could. I mean, she lists sort of 20 things which developed from a moonshot in Mission Economy. Now, I think many of those would have got anyway. I don't think it's credible to say we wouldn't have artificial limbs if we hadn't sent a man to the moon. But you wouldn't have expected to develop artificial limbs in the process of sending the man to the moon. And so whilst I agree with her point that we need to go beyond kind of static cost-benefit analysis, I think for many of these things, you simply cannot have metrics in advance which are going to tell you this is good or this is bad. So you have to return to, firstly, what does the data on average say? And the data on average, I contend, says it's not good to do big projects where you think you know more than the market because you tend not to. That's true whether you're a big firm or whether you're a big government. And the theory, I would say, backs that up. And I don't consider the examples in Mission Economy to be compelling counter-evidence. There are some very good stories, but we'd expect some very good stories pretty much whatever happens. So this does put me in a fairly unfortunate position of telling essentially a fairly boring story. I actually think the sort of market failure approach to economics which she criticizes works pretty well. It doesn't say, you know, the market will get everything right. It says the market gets many things wrong, and here's why, and here's what the government can do. And it doesn't mean that I think we shouldn't invest in things like a Green New Deal. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't invest in many things. But what I think it says is it's very valid to determine what we as a society want, although I can't agree that we should first decide what we want and then decide how to pay for it. I think what you want is inseparable from how much you're willing to pay for it. And then you create markets in those things. So it's fantastic that the government said, for example, in the current pandemic, we really want a vaccine which works, meets these criteria. And if you create something which works, we will actually pre-order from you hundreds of millions of doses at a good price. That gives firms an incentive to create it. It doesn't follow that the government should get involved in actually determining what kind of vaccine we build. And I think the role for the government there should be saying, we value this thing, we'll put up money for it, not we insist on having 50% of the equity in it, we'll give you various grants and so on. I think private markets are not only well placed to provide that kind of financing, but the wisdom of the crowd means you get a better sense of what's actually feasible and what is not. And if we look at the EU, I mean, many things have gone wrong in their vaccine rollout. But one of the things was basically backing Sanofi, a French firm. And some of that came down to good old-fashioned national politics. But some of it was thinking, no, we want a European vaccine, which will be developed in Europe, and this will be great, and not putting in enough money, saying basically, you know, whatever vaccines get developed, if they work, we want those, and we'll be willing to fund the companies which create them. So in some senses, this is a not very exciting critique, but I would argue it has the merit of being correct. And I think things can actually go pretty badly wrong when we don't understand this. And so I'd be very interested, Anna, if you've got any questions or if we open it up.
Yeah, that was really comprehensive. Thanks, Matthew. And I appreciate, the loyalty to accuracy rather than excitement. Yeah. One thing I'd like to pick you up on is I get your point about mega projects, therefore not necessarily being the best way to go about things. You then suggested that means that you don't necessarily disagree with the Green New Deal, if I understood you correctly. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think a lot of us here will be really interested in the Green New Deal and how it evolves. It's really complex and pretty hard to understand, but yeah, it would be good to hear how you think not supporting mega projects and supporting the Green New Deal sit together.
Sure. So also I should perhaps clarify there. I mean, sometimes you simply cannot avoid a mega project. Some things are simply very big. I mean, a good example is a large bridge. If you want to go from A to B and the distance in between is very large, you may have no alternative. But in general, it's this broader idea that feedback is really important, and you try and avoid doing huge things like that. In terms of the Green New Deal, I would say actually the examples Mazzucato gives in Mission Economy are quite helpful there. So she talks about Germany's Energiewende, which is their big change to their economy, making it more green over time. And it hasn't actually made it that much more green yet, at least it depends on your metrics. They've massively ramped up wind and especially solar. They've also massively ramped up brown coal, which is about the worst possible thing you can use to provide energy. It's mined near the surface, it's very, very dirty. The reason they've done this is because, as well as ramping up renewables, they've got rid of nuclear. And Mazzucato actually, when talking about kind of the political implications of the sort of missions approach, uses this as an example. She says, after Fukushima, Germans realized this was important and this was a catalyst for developing their Energiewende, their sort of version of the Green New Deal. Well, that probably wasn't a very good idea. I mean, people here might have different takes on that, but nuclear is very environmentally friendly. There are massive issues, admittedly, with what you do with the waste. And I think more thought should be given to those. But that wasn't what Fukushima highlighted. Fukushima highlighted the risk of a tsunami hitting a plant and it causing devastation, which is not going to happen in Germany. So I think there you have a problem of, you have this grand mission, which has a few grand objectives. One of the grand objectives is we should get rid of nuclear power plants entirely. And the result has been that Germany is not actually that more environmentally friendly, many, many years later. Whereas in Britain, we fairly quietly changed many coal power plants, or not changed them, but sort of replaced coal power plants with gas power plants, and actually reduced sort of the damage which our energy generation industry did quite significantly. Now, I think you can also make the case that on balance, you'd still prefer what Germany's doing. Like the investment in renewables is really important and could have a long-term greater payoff than the UK switch. But then it wouldn't be that difficult for the UK to also start ramping up renewables, especially now someone else has put the money into making them cheaper. But I think it's a good example of, rejecting missions doesn't mean that you shouldn't even do something like a Green New Deal, because we know climate is a problem. We know there's market failure here. But the solution is to do something like, say, if you provide this very clean form of energy, we will guarantee you this kind of price for it, not for too long, because efficiencies will quickly make that very expensive, but for long enough to basically say to companies, if you've got an idea of something new you want to build, here's a guaranteed market for it. It is worth your while doing this. And not to say, we're going to close all our nuclear power plants because a tsunami might hit us and it will cause civilian devastation.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're advocating for really, really evidence-based decisions, essentially, and creating very proactively creating markets, but still not having too much of a top-down approach.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say it's evidence-based exactly. I think I would say that it's shifting not even the risk, but the kind of thinking process to the market. So it's not saying that we should only invest in things which we know will work, because for many of these things, we're developing new products. No one knows what's going to work. But I think if you have many private firms doing it and they know not the type of thing they need to build, but the kind of product they ultimately need to provide, such as clean energy, that's likely to be far more successful than the states nudging the economy in that direction. And I think actually on something like a Green New Deal, this is perhaps where the lines are sort of least clear between the sort of view I would adopt and Mazzucato's view. But then I think that says quite a lot. I don't think that's because we need a mission here. I think that's because actually fairly mainstream economics would say, yes, this is pretty much what we want to do. I think in a sector like space, where it's less clear, there's a sort of social imperative to do it. The distinctions become more obvious.
And do you think that the market can solve problems? I mean, especially thinking about something like climate change, up until this point, the market has been very, very slow, and governments as well. But do you think that without things like missions and without a more active state, we actually can solve? I mean, I say the problem is it's multiple complex problems, but do you think we can tackle climate change within the time frame that we need to with a primarily market-based approach and without the level of state intervention or state leadership that Mazzucato is advocating for?
I think you need the state intervention. I would question whether you need the state leadership. I mean, I think with climate change, there are kind of two things going on. One is the kind of classic tragedy of the commons issue, which is, you know, even if, say, the UK, for example, completely eliminated, you know, if we could flick a switch and become zero carbon tomorrow, possibly at great cost, if we could do so, it would have an impact, but not very much of an impact on the world. I think probably China doing that would have the greatest impact. And even then, you know, it's not going to be that close to 50% of the impact. And so it's always going to be very difficult for countries to pay a price and, you know, deal with climate change. And I think there it's not a case of missions or a case of markets. There you need some form of, not necessarily global governance, but you need some form of international agreement. I mean, it's great the US has now rejoined the Paris agreements, and basically we need things like that. And I think there, you know, insofar as economics is relevant, economics has said all it's going to say. But on a more national level, once governments have decided what they want to do, yeah, I think you need state investment, because essentially you do have to create a market in these things. But I don't think you need the level of state leadership. So I would agree the market has not been especially effective so far on dealing with climate change, but I don't see why anyone would expect it to. I mean, there's simply not been that many incentives there for firms to deal with climate problems, except when it's created profit for them. And you could see this as a criticism of markets, but I don't think that's very helpful. Like, I disagree with Mazzucato's argument that we shouldn't primarily think about this in terms of market failure, and the sort of perfect competition baseline is not helpful. I think you have to start somewhere, and markets are the right place to start. And once you start from there, you might depart quite far from a kind of pure market-based theory. In this case, you've got to make people actually have an incentive to be environmentally friendly, but it's still the right way, I would argue, to tackle it. And I don't think the fact that markets haven't been doing much of that so far is evidence that we shouldn't approach it that way.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's important for us not to conflate governments putting in place certain incentives for markets to go in a certain direction with the actual mission-oriented approach, which is a much more proactive and specific way of doing things. Please throw questions into the chat, or yeah, I mean, it'll be hard for me to see everybody, but please do put questions in the chat, or I will just keep asking away. You sent me a really interesting article, Matthew, by Diane Coyle, and her argument was that this is essentially a technocratic framework to solve a fundamentally political problem. And I think Mazzucato herself, or if not, it cropped up in one of the webinars that that she was participating in, highlighted how there was a lot of criticism around the time of Apollo that the US could be so incredible and technologically get someone to the moon, and at the same time not solve much more societal issues such as racism and inequality and poverty and things like that. So I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on that critique, and if you think she's slightly missed the mark on trying to outline this technocratic solution, which essentially avoids the fact that there is a lack of political will to solve the kinds of challenges which she's talking about using them for.
Yeah, I would take a slightly different view on that, actually. I think Diane Coral's review, which is in prospect, by the way, is definitely worth reading and is somewhat complementary but different to the kind of things I'm saying here. But I think actually the mission's approach is not that useful as a technocratic fix, but it probably could be quite useful in terms of getting people interested in the area, kind of encouraging people to think, you know, this is something we could do, this is a way the government could operate. As I've said, I don't really think it's the right way to approach it, but I think actually on that level it holds some promise. In terms of broader questions around, you know, equity and power and how all of this relates to that, I think she has some discussion of it, doesn't she? Like, she says it's very important that this is inclusive and everyone is involved. And I think those points are absolutely right. Again, I just would say I don't think missions are really the right way to do it. To an extent, the sort of general criticism of economics is it's departed from its roots in political economy. And I think that tends to be right. But here, I think actually a kind of division between politics and economics could be quite helpful. Like, you know, this is going to cause trade-offs, and some people are going to want some things and some people are going to want some other things. And I don't think that's just a case of people being mistaken or having some kind of false consciousness. People genuinely have different interests, not just on the Green New Deal, but on all sorts of things. I think it's quite good to have those political fights openly in the proper arena, and let the economics then say, once we as a society have decided what we want, this is the most efficient way to do it. This is a way which is going to incorporate feedback. This is the way which is actually going to help us get where we want to go.
No, that's perfect. Thanks, Matthew. David, you've put a question in the chat. Do you want to read it out or elaborate on it?
Well, we're having this very useful discussion about the Green New Deal as one possible mission, but the other mission that's often referred to is the mission to change how our health service is focused. Everybody says it would be nice if we were doing more prevention and early treatment rather than leaving people to get ill and spending so much money patching them up after they're ill. But it seems impossible to make this change. The market seems to be much more interested in making money out of treatments rather than getting less money from prevention. So is this something the market is unable to fix? And if so, is that something suited to some kind of public-led mission, either a Mazzucato-style mission or possibly a different kind of mission?
So I think that's a really interesting question, because what comes to mind there is not, for me at least, is not only a market-based solution, but actually a series of adverts on the Tube in London, which many of you might remember. I can't remember the firm which did them, but they involved a sausage dog. And the premise of these was it was a health insurance firm which was offering people, I can't remember if it was an Apple Watch or something similar, but basically new wearable technology which tracked various biometric bits of data on you. And it was basically saying, if you sign up to our health insurance, we will give you an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or whatever. And if you then do 10,000 steps a day or something like that, or if you go to the gym 3 times a week, or basically if you do all of these things, we will reward you with lower premiums. Now, there's quite an interesting question there about that, what that does to the insurance industry as they have more and more data on individual people. Traditionally, the reason it works is because you have a large pool of people and you don't know that much about them. But that is a kind of market-based solution to that. And I think that kind of shows what the problem is. Like, it's true, if you're creating a series of drugs, you have more of an incentive to provide a drug which will give a cancer sufferer an extra year of life than something which cures a dreadful disease, but just takes one course of treatment to solve it. But that's a problem with basically what we as a society value. And so yes, the market has issues with that if you look at it through the framework of pharmaceutical firms. But the real problem here is, what are we willing to buy? And this has shown that health insurance firms, quite sensibly, are willing to buy reduced risks for the people they'll have to pay out for. And I think the NHS should treat it the same way. And in fact, I think they do. I mean, the NHS funds podcasts, for example, like Couch to 5K, it does things like this. And I think it should do more of that kind of thing. And it should say, you know, from our perspective, it's much better to have a drug which cures someone rather than extends their life for a bit. And, you know, what we pay for it should reflect that. We need to create a market for it. I think we can't blame firms for not creating drugs which people don't value that much. And if we say, well, they should value them that much, then I think we should be willing to pay for them, and possibly willing to pay less for other things, which actually as a society, we don't value so much.
You say as a society we don't value it. I'm sure almost if everybody was confronted, what would you like more? Would you like to remain healthy without becoming ill, or would you like to be repaired once you became ill? I think most people would say they prefer the former, and somehow that individual values is not being reflected in the market reality, it seems to me.
Well, just have nice, you know, the body which determines what they're willing to pay for drugs reflect that then.
Yeah, so it sounds like...
Otherwise, you end up with a situation where you're basically saying, actually, the money does exist for this, and pharmaceutical firms are leaving a lot of it on the table. And there's a lot of very good journalism, and lots of journalists have written fairly good books on the pharmaceutical industry. And I'd recommend reading them. It was very eye-opening for me. But this does seem to me to be a common theme in the sort of concluding chapters of those books. Without explicitly saying it, you end up with the idea that if only they'd funded this plucky scientist, they'd have made a lot more money more quickly than they actually did. And basically, pharmaceutical firms are leaving a huge amount of money on the table. And I think they're not. I think the problem is we're not actually providing money for the things we want. Now, if it helps to sell that politically by saying we need a mission, we need to cure people for life, we need to focus on public health and let everyone live a kind of life characterized by well-being, or whatever you want to say, then okay. But I don't think we actually need to go that far. We can just say we've determined what we want. What we want is drugs which will cure these kind of things. If someone creates them, we'll be willing to pay a lot for them. And perhaps we're not so concerned actually about something which will extend someone's life for a year, valuable though that is, and we're going to adjust the amount we're willing to put into that downwards.
I think in the interest of time, we've got a few questions coming in, so I'm going to read out Catherine's. Yeah, it's really about the lack of power analysis in Mariana's thinking, and there's obviously Anne Pettifor, it sounds, has written something around this, which I haven't actually read, but she's saying, I think the point is that Mariana slightly ignores the reality of powerful actors who will scupper the scope for genuine societal dialogue leading to what missions are focused on. So actually the pharmaceutical example sounds like a really good potential case study of that, where if you have a lot of, I don't want to say disinformation, but if you have a lot of a certain kind of information which might be verging on disinformation, how do you actually tackle that power imbalance and create the conversations that we need to help people realize or help people voice what they do actually value, and have that then influence markets?
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes down to having the state influence markets, either by having it intervene directly, or as I think is better, having it basically say we're willing to pay a lot for this kind of thing, even if it doesn't exist yet. And I think ultimately questions around power are really important, and it's got to be a political process. I don't think however you set these markets up, whether you have missions, whether you literally pick winners, whether you say we're willing to pay a lot for this and we'll let the market deal with feedback and so on, I don't think any of those things solve that, to be honest. I'm not a political scientist. That's not really my area of expertise. My bias would be towards being much, much less willing to accept all kinds of money in politics. I'm not sure if you'd literally want to fund political parties by the state. I think the Netherlands do. I'm sure some countries do. I'm not sure if that's a very good idea because it might make it harder to enter and so on. Possibly there are ways of setting that up. But I think certainly what we see in America, and to a lesser extent, but somewhat of an extent in the UK, the amount of money involved in politics is not good. I think insofar as economics has anything to say about it, it tends to just be rent seeking. So basically doing things which will let you get money, not by creating value, but by having political power. But then I think, the fight to get a lot of money out of politics is also, not really to do with economics. Like, I think it's important, but I'm not sure it's that relevant to economics. I think doing things like this and keeping things like that in mind is probably how you make progress on solving that problem.
No, that's really interesting, because I think there's quite a big debate in economics happening at the moment. You've got, I can't remember their names, but the authors of Freakonomics almost arguing that everything in the world to some extent is economics. And then you have some pushback against that. I think Ha-Joon Chang has said, he's a really interesting economist, he said actually no, economics applies to a very specific arena, and we should keep it within that arena. And yeah, you're right in that economics has kind of departed from political economy, but actually we need to not try and get it to answer every single question perhaps, and appreciate where the politics needs to do its job alongside the economics. So George has a question. George, you want to explain?
Sure. It's only mentioned briefly by Marianne in the book, but I mean, she comes out being a bit skeptical of the influence of carbon pricing on changing behaviour. So, and just wonder what your thoughts about the political realities of market-based mechanisms like carbon pricings are to fundamentally change behaviour in industries. Will a high enough carbon price, for instance, ever be politically palatable?
Yeah, I think there are kind of two things going on there. One is, I think realistically we need a very high carbon price. The figures I was seeing recently was saying something like about £100 a tonne or $100 a tonne, which is, I know the US has just increased its target, but it's well above what they're saying. It's well above anywhere in the world now. So I suppose there are two issues there. One is it politically feasible to do what we need to do? But that's going to apply to pretty much anything, whether by sort of governmental fiat you say you simply cannot produce more than this, or whether you put in an equivalent carbon tax, or whether you issue only a limited number of permits. It ends up being the same cost for carbon users. And if the price is too high and they're not willing to pay that, I don't know what you do, to be honest. I think then again you have a political problem. But I would say that again, any economic framework is going to have that same problem, because the fundamental problem there is people need to pay a certain price to use carbon responsibly, and they're not willing to do so. The sort of specific issue with cap and trade schemes is whether, I suppose, they're more vulnerable to that kind of political pressure than things like a carbon tax. Like, I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that issuing more carbon permits and thus effectively reducing the price of carbon in that system is less of a story than reducing a carbon tax. I think a carbon tax would be a great thing to have, to be honest. I realise there'd be a lot of issues in actually implementing it, sort of boring but important issues of how you actually measure things. Obviously, you'd have to apply it to imports as well to stop activity just being substituted abroad. Then it can get quite difficult in terms of actually tracking how much carbon is in things, especially if it's been fueled by electricity generated in many different ways. I think actually economists don't really pay enough attention to those kind of practical issues. But on the kind of pure economic theory level, yes, cap and trade and carbon taxes can be made to be equivalent. In terms of politics, a carbon tax, I think, would probably be better insulated against those kind of issues. But I think it does again come back to this fundamental problem that, it's a political issue. Economics can help you do things in the most efficient way possible, given our lack of information and so on, or maybe not the most efficient way possible, but it can help. But sometimes you just have a political problem. People probably don't want to pay that much for carbon. I would say they need to pay that much for carbon, and however they end up paying that much for carbon it's still going to be a problem. And I'm not really a fan of things like universal basic income, but I do think issuing a carbon tax and then letting whatever you raise from that be distributed in the form of a universal basic income or something like that could be a pretty good idea, both to build political will and to discourage people reducing it. But then you could do that in auctioning permits for cap and trade as well. So I'm not sure it's a particularly strong argument for that.
I think that question is probably one that could merit an hour of discussion in and of itself. I'm aware of time, so I think we'll dig into one last question before going into breakout rooms for final reflections. Lan has put in the chat, is this what the social determinants of the health approach aims to do? Lan, do you want to explain this a little bit?
So I didn't really mean that as a question. It was just a reflection on about prevention. It just feels like we've already had a whole conversation about prevention of health and health inequalities, and we've got all the research and the strategies. It was part of it. Some commentators say it was just too difficult to tackle and too big. On the other hand, there's also just a lack of political will, just indicating that there's, I guess, going back to the comments about power, this is not necessarily about market power, but institutional power. A lot of this, like, we've already got a strategy for doing this as sorts. We've got the Marmot principles for the plan for how to tackle it, and it was kind of started, but then it's dropped off because back to politics. There's just not the interest in it. There's not the capacity at local authorities who are seemingly going bankrupt and in debt, and it's been done piecemeal. Some of the principles are implemented in some parts. So it was just an indication that a lot of this is, I guess, it's back down to the political economy and bringing the economics back into that. Like if you take the institutional economics approach, with like the four different, like William's 4 different layers of 4 different layers of institution. The market is the 4th layer and the newest layer, embedded in all those other things. That's maybe, I guess, I feel that maybe tying up with all the other things that this this approach isn't quite embedded into the institutional into the institutions, into the political economy, which is what you covered already.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Lan, and apologies for reading that.
No, it's my fault. I didn't.
In advance. No, and it's great to see the conversation happening in the chat. I think there are some really interesting reflections to come out. But actually, rather than sharing my own reflections, put everybody in breakout rooms again. And the main idea behind this is that, yes, this is really a space for learning and reflection, but ultimately we want to turn that learning into some kind of action. So before we finish every book club session, we tend to ask people to think, okay, what can your key takeaway be? Is there one person you'd like to have a conversation with to share these ideas with, or is there something you'd like to change as a result of the discussion and what you've learned? So yeah, take a minute to pause for thought on those things, and I'll bring everybody back probably in about 3 minutes, just so we've got time to wrap up before 7:45. hopefully you didn't all run out of time, although I suspect
yes.
that wasn't quite the case. Yeah, I potentially need to make these a little bit longer, but I'm also aware it cuts into people's dinner time. So yeah, it's a trade-off. Does anyone want to share a thought before we close up?
The thought from our group was
Sorry.
that we need to be better at measuring things. If we're going to be evaluating ourselves by feedback, we need to know what we're feeding back, and it's not just economic well-being. It needs to be something else to complement. And if that's in place, then maybe there's more hope for these mission projects.
Sarah, you were in a different group, weren't you?
Yep, yeah, I was just reflecting actually to the group and applying it, having worked in economic development, to my application of the book's thinking was around the ITIs, the Intermediate Technology Institutes that were set up back in the early 2000s with £450 billion investment per annum, for over a 10-year period, but were wound up within 7 years, so they didn't even work their way through. For, I guess, valid reasons, but it's about, there was a mission there, and what can we learn as we apply the thinking, and as this book in particular, to some really good case studies in Scotland that we've got, and learn from them. That's what inspired me to do, is to take the book analysis and apply it to what I understand of that initiative.
Amazing. All right, well, in the interest of time, I think we will leave it there. Matthew, thanks so much for spending your evening with us. I think we've all found it really, really valuable. And yeah, you've given us a lot of insight, which I really don't think would have come up in conversation otherwise. So thank you for that. And thank you everybody for joining. It's always so lovely to get some familiar faces and to have some new people join as well. I think that also creates really constructive and insightful conversation. So there's not one in the diary for April yet, but I will just share again the link. So please do join the WhatsApp group if you'd like to stay in the loop, or you can follow #WeAllRead on Twitter if Twitter is your preferred mode of contact. And yeah, I'm thinking of doing the next subject around the relationship between racism and capitalism, and potentially, rather than basing it on one book, encouraging people to bring different books or different articles that they've read, because yeah, I think there's just so much in that subject to read and understand. So would be very interested to hear your thoughts on what you might recommend, and how we can structure that conversation. So yeah, we'd love to see you all again, and thank you so much, and have a very happy Wednesday evening.
Thanks, Anna. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.